Hello, this is Tom Christensen on April 8th, 2022, coming to you from Milton, Georgia, an outer suburb of Atlanta. My subject today is locally led conservation and the imperative for effective local working groups. I currently work in the private sector, principally in water management, but prior to that I had a 40-year career with USDA. I started as a soil conservationist in Union County, North Carolina. And I always considered myself fortunate because Union County was part of the first conservation district along with Anson County in the Brown Creek Conservation District. And of course, Anson County was the home of the first chief of the Soil Erosion Service, Hugh Hammond Bennett. The last position I occupied with NRCS was Associate Chief for Operations. During my career with USDA, I held 16 different positions in 9 locations, with the last 24 years at national headquarters. I'm also one of the originators of the National Conservation Planning Partnership, along with Leonard Jordan and Rich Drewsterhouse. And we actually began discussions in 2014 and the consummation of those discussions in 2015 with the formation of NCPP. I really want to thank the National Conservation District Employees Association and the National Conservation Planning Partnership for this opportunity to give this presentation. Before I get into a discussion of locally led conservation and local work groups, I'd like to spend just a moment setting the playing field for today's conservation work, touch a bit on the expectations for today's natural resource stewards, the growing challenges that these stewards face, and how important the work of conservation districts is in helping these stewards to meet these challenges and expectations. So when one looks at the natural resource stewards of today, there's an expectation that they produce food and fiber at low cost, it'd be safe, it'd be abundant. In addition, there's an expectation that they be good neighbors in the face of growing development pressures and the urbanization of agricultural lands. They also are expected to be guardians of natural resource sustainability for future generations. And then more recently, we hear a lot of discussion about climate smart approaches, whether it be production of commodities or other products from farm settings, farm and ranch settings. There is an expectation that they're going to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions and increase carbon sequestration. In addition, there's always this expectation that multiple conservation benefits come from conservation work on the farm and off the farm, including a positive return for this growing public investment that has taken place within the last generation. There are also a suite of growing challenges for today's natural resource stewards. More weather extremes, including severe droughts, shifting trade policies that impact market access and pricing in certain markets, and pricing that is largely beyond a producer's control, health pandemics, just as we are in with COVID, and how that impacts supply, production, and distribution systems, increasing ag production uncertainty and risk at local, regional, and international scales, and regulatory interests that are waiting in the background to exert influence. With the increased expectations and challenges for today's natural resource stewards, more is expected of conservation districts than ever before. There's a need for improved technical assistance capacity, but also capability and the tools to support them. There's a need to streamline and make financial assistance opportunities more flexible and less burdensome. There's a need for innovation, cost-effective and practical solutions. Certainly a need for enhanced specialization too, as the client base has grown in diversity of needs. In addition, there's always a need for improved coordination and effective partnerships to leverage financial resources and actions. And districts today are really expected to be in a constant state of readiness, responsiveness, and flexibility in serving this new diverse customer suite of needs. In addition, given that there's so much public resources now involved in private lands conservation, there's an expectation for enhanced results and outcomes. This training module is intended to cover locally led conservation, what it is, why it's essential, its origins, key milestones over the decades, and optimizing its effectiveness, and local work groups, their purpose, origins, and statutory basis, essential roles, leadership and membership, operational framework, relationship to locally led conservation, and its importance to the efficacy of programs, services, and activities. In this process, too, we'll also discuss America's conservation delivery system, the unique local, state, and federal partnership that has existed since the 1930s. This quote from NACD in December 1996 at the bottom of the slide I think is very important. It says, conservation districts should play the lead role in locally led conservation process. The process, which is resource-driven rather than program-driven, should be used to guide and coordinate all federal, state, and local conservation efforts. The NRCS Programs Manual provides a good definition of locally led and also of local. And I'll read those to you here. Locally led conservation is based on the principle that community stakeholders are best suited to identify and resolve local natural resource problems. Thus, community stakeholders are key to successfully managing and protecting their natural resources. It challenges neighbors, both urban and rural, to work together and take responsibility for addressing local resource needs. And local, of course, does not just mean county in this context. It could be a portion of a county, a watershed, a multi-county region, or really whatever geographic area is best suited to address the resource conservation needs identified. Local may also include specific sectors of a county, watershed, region, or community with common resource concerns. Here's some additional explanations of locally led conservation. I particularly like the first one on the slide, which is a quote from Uham and Bennett in 1947. It says, basic to the success of our national program is the leadership of the local farmer soil conservation district supervisors, elected by their neighbors to these democratically organized soil conservation districts. Bennett gave a series of lectures in 1958 and 1959, just before he passed away in 1960. These lectures were given at NC State College at the time, now university. And I've listened to these audio tapes, which is a series of 8 or 9 lectures. And one of the things he pointed out is as he worked internationally to try to bring the concept of conservation districts to other countries, he observed that the ones that were successful were the ones where they had local referendum, a local vote basically, to form the conservation district. The ones where it failed was there was no local referendum and therefore little support for the conservation district. And so Bennett believed that obviously the local leadership through the referendum process was key to the establishment of conservation districts. This slide provides an excerpt from NACD's Tuesday letter. I can remember receiving the Tuesday letter in hard copy, and we always look forward to that. This particular issue in winter of 1997 had an article titled, What Exactly is Locally Led Conservation? I won't repeat what's on the slide here, but the bottom line is it's important to recognize that this is a process, and it's a never-ending process because you're always reviewing and evaluating those needs and accomplishments and making adjustments, applying lessons learned, etc. The basic question on this slide is what fortifies this continuing need for locally led conservation? There's a couple of key points here. Conservation needs and opportunities certainly differ from local setting to local setting, as do people's perspectives, their acceptance of different approaches, and the supporting resources that they have for locally led conservation. In addition, top-down singular approaches historically have been less successful and in many cases highly unsuccessful. And certainly they're not sustainable because you have to have the landowner, the land user, and the community buy-in and a commitment towards the path forward to solutions. And of course, natural resource interrelationships and issues are complex, and no single entity, approach, or program is going to be equally effective in each local setting. There's a quote here from Chief Peter Myers of SCS in April of 1985, recognized that that was the 50th anniversary of the Soil Conservation Service. But it's a very appropriate point. And the quote says, but 50 years have taught us that no single program, no single agency, no single organization can solve the nation's soil and water conservation problems. No single approach, federal, state, or local, has all the answers. Why is locally led conservation essential to results? Well, we know that local leaders know the conditions and natural resource setting best, have earned the trust of the community and operate with keen attention to the local needs, expectations, and even the cultural norms. Locally led conservation is a proven effective means to help landowners, land users, project sponsors, and communities achieve their conservation goals through a voluntary approach. And it facilitates input from multiple stakeholders and coordinated action among partners to optimize improvements and enhancements. This quote here from E.C. MacArthur, first president of the National Association of Soil Conservation District Governing Officials in August of 1946, recognize that's the predecessor to NACD, is a very appropriate one. He says that unless you do your job well and unless districts succeed, we run the risk of losing our soil. We also run the risk of inviting government land regulation or of reverting to the old, inefficient demonstration methods of the past. Neither alternative is anywhere near as desirable as success with the program we now have in conservation districts. The next 4 slides provide an overview of the timeline in the development of locally led conservation. This first slide talks to a time period of 1933 to 1937. Some of you will recognize that that was the period when the Soil Erosion Service was first established, temporary agency in the U.S. Department of Interior. In 1935, the Soil Erosion Service was moved over to the Department of Agriculture, and then legislation changed it to the Soil Conservation Service also in 1935. But also recognized during that time period of 1933 to 1937, work was being done through watershed-based demonstration projects. There were no conservation districts in place. There was no national program as far as working across the landscape. And efforts were focused on these demonstration projects with the thought that if we demonstrated in key watersheds, we'd be able to show farmers and ranchers how to carry out conservation, and that would spread on its own. They soon recognized, though, at the national level, that this was not going to be effective in achieving conservation goals. The task was too vast, too complex to be solved by a central government agency. And you had to have trusted local leadership essential to both scale up and speed up cooperative action on farms, ranches, across watersheds, and in key landscapes. And that led in 1937 to President Roosevelt providing to governors the draft standard state soil conservation districts law. And each state, of course, made modifications to this law, adopted it at their own pace, but that resulted in the formation and the authorities and the roles and responsibilities of local conservation districts. Some of the folks that were key behind this legislation at the national level were M.L. Wilson, who was an assistant secretary in USDA, and Philip Glick, who was an attorney at USDA and worked on much of the draft language. Bennett certainly had involvement, but when you listen to his tapes of the lectures from 1958 to 1959, he doesn't claim that he was the originator of this concept. Certainly, though, we know behind the scenes he must have been essential and key to the development of this draft legislation. And as I mentioned earlier, 1937 was the establishment of the first conservation district, Brown Creek Soil Conservation District in Anson and Union counties, and of course, Anson County being the home of UHAM and Bennett. 1938 was a key year in the development of locally led conservation. Secretary of Agriculture Henry Wallace established an MOU upon the request of the Conservation District Board to formalize cooperative working relationships with USDA. As part of developing an MOU, a conservation district had to establish its long-term objectives and also develop an annual work plan to support those objectives. USDA would review these annual work plans, but in 1940, only 2 or 3 years later, they quickly recognized that this was sending the wrong signal and gave the appearance of USDA control over local conservation districts. So this was discontinued. 1946, that brought about the formation of the National Association of Soil Conservation District Governing Officials. First meeting was held in January in Washington, D.C. 49 district officials got together and they drafted Edgar C. MacArthur from South Carolina to begin the process to organize a national association. And in July of 1946, in Chicago, Illinois, MacArthur and 17 selected association members formed the National Association, which we now know as the National Association of Conservation Districts. The 1950s were an interesting time period with all the growth after the war in urbanization, housing developments, etc. There was a movement to begin to provide conservation assistance in urbanizing areas. And this first took place outside of Washington, D.C., Fairfax County, Montgomery County. It also took place outside of Chicago and Milwaukee, and then spread across the country as what NRCS, then SCS, and conservation districts were doing locally applied also to urban lands and the conservation needs there. 1962 brought about the modernization of the 1938 MOU with conservation districts. In addition, in 1969, the title of work unit conservationist is what you found at the county level for SCS was changed to district conservationist. That title of district conservationist did exist prior to this, but it was used for what we now know as the assistant for field operations or area conservationist position. But it was felt that the use of the district conservationist title was more appropriate at the local level with the local conservation district. In addition, 1977 brought about some strengthening of the work that SCS could do on tribal lands. And in addition to that, of course, the 1985 Farm Bill was monumental, really earth-shaking with its implications for locally led conservation as conservation compliance came on the scene. And we struggled with that implementation for a good decade or more. In addition, the National Conservation District Employees Association was formed in 1992, and they're one of the key 5 partners that form the conservation delivery system. 1996 Farm Bill signaled a shift back to greater support for locally led conservation. 1999 saw the delivery of 60 workshops on local capacity building as a partnership effort between NACD, NASCA, and NRCS. 2008 saw a very important amendment to the 1985 Farm Bill with the establishment of local work groups as subcommittees of the State Technical Committee and therefore exempt from FACA. 2015 saw the establishment of the National Conservation Planning Partnership to reinvigorate the joint commitment to conservation planning. And 2015 saw the establishment of a first ever national level MOU between NACD, NASCA, the RC&D Association, the Conservation District Employees Association, and NRCS to support the delivery system and locally led landowner decision making. The question is, how is locally led conservation most effective in today's natural resource setting? Well, there's a couple of key points I try to make in this slide. Certainly, having an energized, committed, and informed conservation district board supported by capable and proficient staff is highly important to having effective locally led conservation. I was a district conservationist prior to the formation of local work groups, but I was most fortunate to have a very strong and effective and active conservation district board in Clinton County, New York. Also, in addition to a board that is very active, you have to have support for them at the local, particularly the state, the regional, and the national levels with policies, processes, resource tools, and the design of programs. In addition, there's important training that district leaders need, particularly as they transition onto a board or a new board member, and opportunities for them to exchange information and experiences based on the lessons that they have learned. In addition, what I've observed is district boards that are most effective also have a process and an understanding of how to transition in new board members, transfer knowledge, and make that transition as seamless as possible. When on-the-ground results are paramount is also when locally led conservation is most effective. In other words, never losing sight that what this is all about is getting conservation practices and systems on the ground that work for the farmer, the rancher, the forest steward, but also produce the environmental benefits that is expected by society today. We're now going to transition specifically to local work groups. And the first slide here talks about the purpose of a local work group. And of course, at its most basic level, that is to provide recommendations on local natural resource priorities and criteria for conservation programs and activities. This includes, but it's not limited to, identification of local community priority natural resource concerns and areas, identification of priority conservation program funding needs, and conservation practice and systems of critical importance, approaches and techniques for outreach and information efforts, including to historically underserved people and communities, and criteria for use in ranking program applications. It's always important to remember that the local work group is advisory in nature, doesn't have implementation or enforcement authority, but by the same token, NRCS is responsible for giving strong and thoughtful consideration to local work group recommendations, and in my opinion, must explain to the local work group how their recommendations, their concerns were addressed. How do local work groups effectively support locally led conservation? Well, they reinforce the locally led principle for conservation in a formalized manner with consistent application and timing across the nation. In addition, they introduce new local work group participants and stakeholders to conservation districts and the leadership role that districts play with locally led conservation and how the conservation district takes in and uses community input. Additionally, it affords additional opportunity for conservation districts to exhibit their local leadership role by convening and chairing the local work group. And here's a quote from Brent Van Dyke, who was a former president of NACD. In 2018, this quote said, "Local working groups led by conservation districts help to inform state technical committees about how the U.S. Department of Agriculture should implement Farm Bill conservation programs to ensure the resource needs of each state and region are met." If a local work group is going to be impactful, it must have effective conservation district leadership. And why must the conservation district be the leader? Well, it's consistent with their historical role of conservation districts since 1937. It reinforces their leadership responsibility for local guidance and direction for conservation programs, services, and activities. And because conservation district leaders are recognized for their integrity and representation of community interests, not self-interest or self-serving purposes. In addition, conservation districts respect landowners, land users, and communities as the decision makers. And of course, they know the local natural resource setting and the priority conservation needs across soil, water, plant, animal, and air resources. Conservation district leaders also capitalize on established effective working relationships and know how to leverage complementary resources across a robust array of stakeholders and partners. In addition, conservation districts uniquely understand America's conservation delivery system and how to optimize it at the local level for effectiveness that produces sustained results. Local work groups have their statutory origins in the Farm Bill. First, the 1985 Farm Bill established state technical committees to provide recommendations on the implementation of conservation programs and activities. Importantly, the 1996 Farm Bill expanded the role of state technical committees and provided the opportunity for interested individuals and groups to advise NRCS on how best to implement locally led conservation programs and activities. The 2008 Farm Bill, as mentioned earlier, also established local work groups as subcommittees of the State Technical Committee and therefore exempt from the requirements of FACA. The quote here at the bottom from Philip M. Glick, who was the attorney who worked on the preparation of the standard state soil conservation districts law, I think is very appropriate. It says, "We do far more through cooperative action by the federal government, the state government, and the local government than we do separately." How is a local work group connected to a state technical committee? Well, as I mentioned on the previous slide, the 2008 Farm Bill established local work groups as subcommittees of the State Technical Committee. And because the State Technical Committee is exempt from FACA, therefore local work groups as subcommittees are also exempt from FACA. And that's a good thing because FACA really has a lot of bureaucratic requirements, structural and operational requirements, and includes formal reporting and oversight procedures. And by being a subcommittee of the State Technical Committee, much of that can be avoided. Local work groups, of course, make recommendations to both the State Technical Committee and the NRCS designated conservationist. In many cases, in most cases, in fact, that's the district conservationist, but in some states with different structures, etc., it could be a different position. Therefore, it calls it the designated conservationist. While local work groups have a statutory basis, there's also another set of supporting documents regarding the implementation of local work groups. Of course, one of those is the Code of Federal Regulations, i.e. the rulemaking process that comes after farm bills. Of course, there's the NRCS directive system. There's also the NRCS website under the programs arena, which has a lot of information. And of course, there's the programs manual, which has a section on locally led conservation. The membership of a local work group is vitally important to its representation and also its effectiveness. Of course, you're looking for diverse local representation of people with ag and natural resource interests, inclusive of, but not limited to, the following: ag producers representing the local range of crop and livestock varieties raised in both rural and urban settings, non-industrial private forest landowners, members of ag, conservation, and environmental organizations, and employees of government agencies with ag and natural resource programs. As importantly, attention must be given to representation of the diverse scope of local people that could be served. Historically underserved, including minorities and women, persons with disabilities, beginning and limited resource farmers, and socially and economically disadvantaged people. I mentioned earlier there is an NRCS designated conservationist that works with the local work group. Again, in many cases, this is the district conservationist. There's a number of responsibilities associated with that position, including assisting the conservation district in identifying members for the local work group, assistance in preparing information and materials to support the local work group in its discussions of resource priorities and program needs, supporting and advising the local work group on technical, programmatic, and procedural matters related to conservation delivery, ensuring fair and thoughtful consideration is given to local work group recommendations related to NRCS programs and services, even performing the responsibilities of the conservation district when not present at a local work group meeting. Of course, we hope that is not the case. We want the district to be in the lead. It informs the local work group of actions taken on its recommendations within 90 days. There are also a suite of standard operating procedures for conducting local work group meetings. Meetings are open to the public and there must be advance public notice, and they're held at least once a year. Agendas and supporting information must be provided to the local work group members at least 14 days prior to the meeting, and this may be modified further by state open meeting laws. Local work group members will hold an open discussion. Members may be polled, but no voting on issues, as that is not considered appropriate. Non-members are given an opportunity to address the local work group. Summaries for all meetings will be available to the public at the local NRCS office, and local work group recommendations are submitted to the State Technical Committee and also the local designated conservationist for consideration and evaluation. Based on my experience and observations, I have no doubt that the importance of local work groups will continue to increase in the years ahead. There's a growing need for increased stakeholder input in nurturing that input and forming effective partnerships for local action. In addition, we need champions that will help to reduce the complexity and eliminate bureaucratic burden in program delivery. This particularly applies to federal programs. We need this voice for practicality that is ever present and provides practical solutions. In addition, local work groups provide trusted leadership without self-interest or agendas, and this is valued in order to achieve voluntary wise use and management of the natural resource base. Local work groups also afford a public forum for focused discussion centered on local needs and opportunities, of course supported by science and natural resource assessments and analyses. And local work groups certainly provide formalized recommendations that can result in practical solutions that are effective locally. I also believe there are a number of core principles in conservation delivery that local work groups help to reinforce and sustain. And those principles are as follows: conserving land consistent with its capabilities and needs and economic practicality. And that is also something that Uhem and Bennett preached through his tenure as chief of the Soil Conservation Service. In addition, delivering programs and services through a voluntary, locally led approach, building trust and credibility through committed leadership and staff, cultivating partnerships as the basis for input and coordinated actions, responding to public and stakeholder needs for credibility and greater effectiveness, and fostering creativity and innovation for improved solutions that work locally. The following quote is important. The parties share a long-term commitment to the voluntary federal, tribal, state, and local government conservation delivery system to help private landowners, communities, and others conserve natural resources across the nation. This system support local level and private landowner decision-making and capacity for conservation planning assistance that will result in sound science solutions that are practical, economical, and lead to wise use and management of natural resources. And that, of course, comes from the first ever memorandum of agreement signed on February 3rd, 2015 between NACD, the National RC&D Association, NASCA, the National Conservation Districts Employees Association, and NRCS. Now, as we wrap up, a few closing perspectives for your consideration. Locally led conservation, supported by local work groups, I believe has proven to be responsive to local needs within the context of state and regional goals and national objectives. Our delivery system, America's Conservation Delivery System, local, state, federal, is uniquely recognized because it is locally led, it is state-centered, but it's also nationally consistent. Decades of result facilitated by America's Conservation Delivery System speak to the veracity of its unique local, state, and federal design, the commitment and integrity of its leadership and staff, its shared passion for voluntary approach and supportive decision makers, and the importance of the science foundation leading to practical solutions. Again, as USDA Attorney Philip M. Glick stated in 1982, ours is not a layer cake form of government, but a marble cake. Each level of government makes an indispensable contribution. For me personally, no presentation would be complete without a closing quote from Uhem and Bennett, the father of soil conservation. And here's a quote from July 30th of 1947. I consider soil conservation districts one of the most important developments that have come out of the whole soil and water conservation program. Without them, I see no possibility for widespread application and maintenance of conservation practices. The districts are going to endure, and the work in them is going to endure. It will be there when much other work is forgotten, because in districts there is the best possible chance for getting soil conservation into the bloodstreams, the habits of the farmers and the ranchmen. This last slide provides a few key references relevant to locally led conservation. It's certainly not all-inclusive, but there are two authors I'd like to point out in particular. One of those is Douglas Helms, who was an historian for the Soil Conservation Service and the NRCS. He unfortunately has passed away, but the legacy of his publications live on, and I encourage you to look at some of those. They're readily available on the NRCS website and from other sources. In addition, there are two excellent books that were written by Neil Sampson, formerly of NACD. One of those was published in 1985, For Love of the Land, A History of the National Association of Conservation Districts. And the more recent one was published in 2009 with One Voice, the National Association of Conservation Districts. Both really worth reading, and I encourage you to do that if you have not. I really appreciate this opportunity given to me by the National Conservation District Employees Association and also the National Conservation Planning Partnership, and wish you continued success and hope for you that you'll have very effective and impactful local work groups moving forward. Thank you.